Good morning. My name is Julien Lafortune, and I'm a research fellow with the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you for tuning in today for our virtual panel, District Spending of One-Time Funds for Educational Recovery. In today's session, we will examine how school districts use one-time state and federal funding for COVID-19 educational recovery. I'll start with a brief presentation highlighting some of the findings of our recent report, which will then be followed by a panel conversation moderated by Bruce Fuller, Professor of Education and Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Just as a reminder before we begin, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. Finally, at the end of today's program, we have set aside some time to answer audience questions. If you have a question for the panelists, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as time allows. Now on to the presentation. So as I mentioned, this report is about district spending of one-time funds for educational recovery. It's joint with my co-authors, Laura Hill, Nu Gao, Joey Herrera, Manny Prunty, and Daria Starr from PPIC, Bruce Fuller from UC Berkeley, Julian Betts and Karna Malavia from UC San Diego, and Jonathan Eisler from CDE. And just to thank our funders very briefly, this work has been supported by funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education, the Stewart Foundation, and the Dirk and Charlene Kapsnell Foundation. Just as a disclaimer, the opinions represented here today and in our report are only those of the authors and do not represent the views of the U.S. Department of Education, the Institute of Education Sciences, or any of our funders. Now, just to start with a little bit of context, the one-time funding that we saw for educational recovery in the aftermath of the pandemic was unprecedented in its scale. So as of this June, there have been about $60 billion in state and federal funding allocated to public schools in California. Roughly half of that was from the federal government and half of that was from the state government. And just to put that in context, that $60 billion compares to about just the year before the pandemic, there was about $100 billion, $102 billion in state, local, and federal funding for TK through 12 education in California. So that $60 billion represents an enormous sum compared to the amount of ongoing funding that we saw before the pandemic. Where we're at right now, at least through the most recent data we have, is that about 63% of this funding has been spent. So about 1/3 of the funds remain to be spent, and most of the funds the remaining funds have a deadline coming up at the end of at the beginning, of next school year in September of 2024. And so what we did in this report was really try to answer multiple questions about learning recovery and learning recovery dollars. And so first we contextualized a bit on how test scores changed. Then we looked into how federal dollars were spent, how they were allocated across districts of different demographics and socioeconomic conditions. We looked very deeply into how state dollars were spent on the Extended Learning Opportunities Grant Program, or the ELO-G program, by analyzing district level plans. And finally, we did some qualitative work as well with 3 districts, trying to understand whether these dollars led to innovative practices and what sort of constraints maybe prevented districts from using these funds in the ways that they saw most fit. Now, just to kind of provide some context on that first point, test scores fell very sharply across all grades, and this is something you've probably seen or heard before in many other reporting, but just to kind of put a little bit of context on this here, what we're showing is the scale score by grade. So I'll focus on the top line and the top dots. That's the 11th grade, the orange dots at the top. And you can see that there was maybe not so much progress in the years up to the pandemic. And then if we look at the final dot all the way to the right, the kind of post-pandemic test scores, basically the orange dots are showing that the 11th grade test scores are at the level that we would have predicted 8th grade test scores to be at if pre-pandemic trends had continued. If you just look one dot further, you'd see that 8th grade scores are actually at the level where we would have predicted 6th grade scores to be. This is in math. The losses were large in reading as well, and represent significant declines in kind of the average level of academic achievement. So this is the major kind of problem that a lot of these recovery dollars are trying to solve. And so the stimulus funds to address these, these learning losses, as well as the kind of health and safety and technology required to reopen schools, came through several programs. And I'll highlight a few of these and show a graph that kind of puts them all in context. But some of the main ones early on were the Coronavirus Relief Fund, the ESSER, so the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. There were 3 of those actually, ESSER 1, 2, and then ESSER 3, which was the largest at $15 billion. And just to kind of put these in context, here is a graph with each bubble showing a specific stimulus program, with the vertical axis showing how large the program is. That's also denoted by the size of each of these bubbles. And then the horizontal axis showing when the program was passed. And if, this is figures in our report as well and shows the expiration year. And just kind of a key thing to highlight here is that the ESSER $3 are the largest by far, and have an expiration date in 2024. But you can see here that there's a number of stimulus programs of varying size, many in the several billions of dollars, with varying expiration years. So there's a lot for districts here to layer, a lot for them to, quote unquote, braid when they consider how to use these funds to address the academic and socio-emotional issues that they're facing. And so a bit about how these funds were targeted, and we go into more detail on this in the report, but the kind of main thing to keep in mind is that these one-time funds were really targeted towards high need and low income students. So this was basically because most of the funding at the federal or the state level was really allocated to districts based on their share low income or their share high need, which is defined under the state's funding formula. And so the interesting implication of that that we find is actually that this meant that the funding was really highly targeted or very highly correlated in districts that had the lowest scores or districts that had been lagging in terms of their academic performance, compared to what is really a weaker relationship when we look at the association between the allocations and the learning losses. So put differently, because we didn't know where the losses were before the funding was allocated, it was allocated to those students that had the highest need, the lowest income, and the lowest kind of prior achievement levels. But what this really means is that funds are kind of better suited in some sense to address prior achievement needs rather than the learning losses per se. And that's because the losses were pretty widespread across districts of varying socioeconomic and demographic conditions. And so a bit on the federal funding. After when we look just at the federal funding, and here's a graph kind of showing the different categories of spending of these federal funds through the most current school year, we can see an interesting shift or a notable shift in the spending when we compare over time. And so in the first year of the pandemic, a lot of these relief funds went towards technology and materials, as well as health, safety, and nutrition, which was really about, safely reopening schools and providing meals as well. And then in the last 2 years, we've seen a shift where there's kind of relatively less spending on technology, similar levels on health and safety, but more on other interventions to address learning losses, on spending for additional time, extended learning, mental health, school resources, and also just other kind of operational needs that schools have. And so that was a notable shift that we see in the federal spending when we kind of track how that spending has evolved over time. When we look to the state ELO-G, the Extended Learning Opportunities Grant Program, we see that the dollars there went really to accelerate learning and provide student support. So, the vast majority, over 90% of districts use these funding, use funds in some way to provide some acceleration of learning, often through small group instruction or other means. Nearly 90% also used the funds for some level of student supports, and this was mainly focused around meals, mental health, and social emotional learning. And about 84% also used funds, some level of funds, to extend instructional time, mainly through summer programs and extended school year programs. And so finally, when we looked at specific districts to try to get under the hood a bit and to dive more deeply beyond our quantitative findings, we looked at 3 districts across the state, 1 urban, 1 suburban, and 1 rural. And we were really focused on their efforts to both support learning and student well-being, but also, how these dollars aided the kind of return to in-person learning. And that's sort of what we find when we, going through these qualitative findings. That the kind of early dollars really aided the in-person return, with more recent spending going towards what we think are some potentially innovative practices to improve student learning. notably, one thing we find in these case studies that's interesting, both from an organizational perspective and from when the state thinks about how to distribute these dollars, is that the distribution actually varied across districts. So some districts were more centrally allocated, whereas others were based more on site level or principal level decisions, and how that leads to different spending patterns, and perhaps efficacy of spending is something that we hope to explore in further work. And then finally, something that kind of rang loud and clear across these case studies, and as we continue this work, we continue to hear, is that there are significant constraints to spending this money. And so one of those is staffing. So a lot of programmatic expansions that districts would wish to do are constrained by the ability, or rather the inability, to find a qualified staff to make those programs happen. At the same time, districts also feel, or at least report feeling, some level of restriction and constraint from the different kind of programmatic and reporting lack of flexibility on some of the programs. And so that's a concern going forward for the state as well, as we try to both give districts this funding, but also allow them the most flexibility to spend on ways that meets their local context. And so before we get into the panel discussion, I'll just kind of highlight briefly some of the finding, or some of the implications that we think come out of these findings. Again, this is ongoing work, and so these will continue to evolve. But one thing that seems to be pretty clear is that, going forward, given the varied needs and given the varied constraints that districts face, really streamlining these funding sources could aid districts and reduce their planning burden, so they can focus more of their administrative efforts on spending the dollars down, rather than trying to fit these dollars into different buckets. Along those lines, we think that perhaps more effective outreach and assistance, especially in districts with less administrative capacity, could be a great benefit there. As I mentioned before, the funding, at least when we see how it's allocated across districts, seems to be, at least on aggregate, more suited to address pre-existing gaps rather than learning losses per se. And we think that's an important question as we kind of approach ongoing recovery efforts in the coming years, and perhaps whether there needs to be more funding or more ongoing funding, whether we should really be targeting these dollars towards perhaps the learning losses, or maybe more specifically towards the pre-existing gaps that existed prior to the pandemic and have only been exacerbated. And finally, it wouldn't be a PPIC report if we didn't mention something about data, but that's something, again, that kind of rang loud and clear. More consistent data really is kind of needed to assess the use of these dollars if we really want to understand where spending is going, where the constraints exist, and also what sort of programs are the most efficacious to improve outcomes. We just don't have the data mechanisms to kind of track these dollars as they exist right now to answer those questions in kind of a deeply meaningful way. And so I'll leave it at that and just remind you again that you can submit your questions to the Gmail address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I'll leave that up for a moment. And so again, if you have questions the last 15 minutes or so, we'll try to answer those. And so now I'll pass it along to my colleague, Bruce Fuller, who will be moderating the panel discussion portion of this event. Bruce Fuller is a professor of education and public policy at the University of California, Berkeley. Thanks for joining us, Bruce.
Thanks, Julian, and congratulations on a remarkable report chock full of findings and results that are highly relevant both to local actors and folks in Sacramento. To bring the results to life, we've assembled a really stellar panel of folks that are familiar with the local situation, and they'll be coming on screen shortly. It includes Moises Aguirre, who's the superintendent of schools, the Sweetwater Union High School District down in the southern portion of San Diego County. Mary Briggs, Senior Director of Research and Education Policy Development at the California School Boards Association. There's Mary. And Ed Manansala, who's the County Superintendent of Schools in El Dorado County. There's Moises, and Ed will be coming on. To get us started, guys, just wanted to get everyone's initial reflections on the report. Julien and his team have laid out kind of in gory details some of the fallout of the pandemic, as well as some hopefulness about how districts are responding and coming out, this sort of theme of recovery and renewal. So I just wanted to go around each panelist and kind of get your initial sense of what are the lessons learned from this period, and what seems to be working as we recover and maybe revive a spirit of hopefulness and renewal inside local school districts. Why don't we just go in alphabetical order? So I'll start with Moises Aguirre.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. So for us, it was really striking because I think the data that was presented really aligns and reflects our lived experience. So for example, really this pandemic was a series of phases or waves that kind of washed over us. So that initial wave of the pandemic really was about making sure that our students had devices, had the technology on hand, had broadband hotspots so that they could access the internet quite literally. Many of our community are lower socioeconomic status. And so for us, that became the essential component to the response, which is, I think, very much aligns with what the data demonstrated. And then as different waves or phases of this pandemic evolved, we adjusted. We were constantly in a mode of adjustment, review, assessment, response, and kind of this cycle. And it was rapid fire response and rapid fire cycles of analysis and making sure we adjusted our plans because things were changing so quickly. And so the data really does align with our story here at Sweetwater in terms of the nature of how this played out and how it continues to play out. And it really reflects that experience of making sure that the initial phase was making sure we had the infrastructure aspects, and then the subsequent phases to make sure that we had all the supports for our students. And so that meant working with our multiple stakeholders within our district, outside of our district, to ensure we're bringing together a comprehensive response that included our community, our employee associations, just across the board response to ensure we were making those adjustments to address the pandemic as it evolved in real time.
Moises, just quick follow-up. What do you think is working in Sweetwater in terms of addressing learning loss, and what are some of the innovative things you're attempting?
So for us, I think some of the partnerships that we have, and before I go there, really what's working, I think at the end of the day is the commitment we had from our team, our staff members, our teachers, our cafeteria workers, our bus drivers, our custodians, across the board. I think that deep level of commitment to each other definitely helped us respond to such and kind of unforeseen, set of experiences that we all lived through. So for me, that's first and foremost is our team, our parents coming together to support each other. So I think for us, that's for me the strongest aspect of it. And then the different layers of support, we had some partnerships that helped us be able to do some pretty unique things. We were in a pre-existing relationship with the Gates Foundation to bring forward and work on Care Network. And what that does is that in a number of our schools, we're already working on social emotional learning. And how does that support mathematics? So I think more than anything, understanding that the social emotional work is not separate and apart from the academic work, rather they're both part and parcel of educating our next generation of learners. And so for me, those are really the takeaways of what's working is how do we move beyond kind of these different silos of, oh, this is academic, this is social emotional, this is extracurricular, to making sure we have a whole child approach, a whole student approach to the work that we do. I think those partnerships have really helped us build upon that knowledge base and really provide a more comprehensive approach. And so then I think and I also would be remiss not to mention that I think we're very grateful as a district to be able to have had the support from the state and federal governments from a resource perspective to be able to do some of these innovative practices that we would have otherwise not been able to fund, especially when responding to a worldwide pandemic. So that I think is something that worked. Again, just coming together partnership.
Thanks, Moises. The other day at our field visit down in San Diego County, Moises also mentioned that his staff discovered teachers that had very strong connections with students, and some of the students reported that the only reason they were showing up was because Jose Rodriguez, my math teacher, cares about me, and those sorts of human scale stories I think are super compelling. Mary Briggs from CSBA.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I want to echo a few things that Moises has mentioned and kind of build on that a little bit. So I think one of the things that we learned is that maybe it wasn't as much a lesson for local educators and local education leaders, but maybe the scope and scale of the pandemic's impact highlighted it more for the public and legislators, that many of those needs that we've seen highlighted, like mental health or inequities that predated the pandemic, had been under-resourced for decades, and we know that the recovery period is going to outlast the funding. And so, we're learning along the way what kinds of things we want to continue moving forward. I think, as Moises has mentioned, the importance of engagement and connections to the school community are really critical, particularly, as you mentioned, Bruce, in terms of attendance. You cannot do learning recovery if students are not in school. And so I think that that's really critical as well. And also, I just want to highlight one thing that Julien mentioned in terms of challenges and constraints around staffing is people are really at the heart of the recovery efforts that we're making, whether that be trying to find qualified new staff with the additional funding that was provided, or building on the strengths and support that our existing staff are able to provide. And a real factor in that is also, we're seeing at the local level, real attention to things like burnout, trying to make sure that as we ask more of teachers and principals in terms of trying to make up for that lost learning time and some of the social emotional impacts, what are we doing to make sure that we are able to retain these incredible individuals and build on the strengths that they have?
Great, thanks, Mary. Ed Manansala from El Dorado County.
Thank you. So there's much to the report that mirrors our experiences in El Dorado County. And just for clarification, there are 15 school districts in El Dorado County, 12 TK8 districts that feed into El Dorado Union High School District, and then 2 unifieds, Black Oak Mine, and then Lake Tahoe Unified, just to give you a glimpse of the context that I'm going to be speaking from. There's many ideas already that I could echo that Moises and Mary said, but if I was to add, I think a lesson that we learned is that students and educators truly value community, a sense of belonging and purpose. Bruce, you were just acknowledging that in terms of what you experienced in San Diego County, and that was our experience as well. I attended multiple graduations this year, and there was a refreshed, renewed sense of community in the celebrations. And just to contrast, this graduating class, 2023, they were freshmen when COVID hit, right? So they did not experience a normal year. And then in El Dorado County, the following year, we were dealing with the Caldor fire with 220,000 acres burned. We closed multiple schools. We had the mosquito fire last year up in the northern area of the county. And then this year, which we're appreciating a sense of normalcy, but there's a wake of challenges that we're dealing with as a result of these last 3 years. The one-time dollars made a difference for us. We clearly were able to address concerns from educators, parents, and teachers in our ability to return in the fall of 2020. We had, as it almost feels like PTSD, you even talking about it, there's a sense of rather talk about the class of 2023. But as a reminder, we were thinking about the strategies around a hybrid model, an in-person model, or obviously being fully remote. The dollars allowed us to address each layer well for many of the mitigation strategies that we know of. We did experience the challenges of, just in terms of academic performance, we did see a gap that mirrored the study in terms of our affluent students and Asian students versus our students in poverty, our Latino students and African American students. Fortunately, we've seen steady gains and stability in reading and ELA, yet mathematics in particular is where we've seen our greatest challenges. Remote instruction around mathematics was very difficult, and there's been a cost to that. When we look at our mental health and wellness efforts, that has been a place where we've seen greater gains in our strategies. So if you think about wellness centers at many of our high schools now, where we have a clinician and a social worker, where students, there's a culture now to be able to receive support that has been very positive, but again, reflects the challenges that we dealt with mental health. I think while there's a tremendous amount of gratitude for the one-time dollars, coherence was a challenge with the multiple plans. I know we're just in our opening, so I'm not going to go overly in detail there, but that was significant. The last piece that I would highlight, just in terms of opportunities, there was a mindset shift in the crises and a sense of urgency that for the first time we felt we could be nimble around some areas that we've had significant challenges around. So think about instructional strategies, hybrid strategies, the way that we assess, the way that we communicated with students and parents and educators. We became much more fluid and much more quick and consistent, even to the point where we're doing surveys today, and there's just a sense of, could we even improve in our levels of communication? And what we're seeing is a community that was used to being communicated with on a weekly basis, with a high volume level of content, but much to learn from. But I'll stop there, but just to give just an overview of the challenges, opportunities, and of course lessons.
Thanks, Ed. I want to follow up on, Ed, one of your points, and Mary spoke to this too. Moises talked about community building. It seems like there's two parallel conversations going on now, and Julian's findings highlight the academic side in terms of the severity of learning loss. There's an article this morning's New York Times. Nationally, kids don't seem to be coming back as robustly as we were hoping. So there's going to be this ongoing concern with testing, state results in reading and mathematics. But then all three of you are speaking to this kind of revolutionary shift towards holistic development. How are you all inside districts and locally trying to balance these two conversations, and what seems to be working? Moises, you want to start?
Yeah, so for us, a couple of things is one of the things that I do appreciate is there seems to have been a destigmatization of mental health. Prior to COVID, there was some stigma around it, whereas coming out from this pandemic, we're much more able to have that discussion from an empathetic perspective. So I think that's something of a takeaway for us that's lesson learned. Also, similar to what Ed mentioned, we've started with having wellness centers at our schools and our district office for our staff as well. So I think that's the other thing that we've also learned is a lesson for us, is making sure that we're providing resources for our staff as well as our students, because again, this pandemic had so many layers to the impacts that were felt across our community. So that is definitely something for us that is a lesson in terms of what's working well, is really kind of bringing together a focus on kind of the whole student, whole child. And we're a secondary district, so our kids are middle and high school. But again, kind of having that emphasis on providing supports, whether it may be counseling. We have a partnership with our county here in San Diego with Health and Human Services to have a mental wellness clinic on one of our campuses, as well as kind of diverse partnerships throughout our community. So I think the more we can have resources to be able to provide those supports, so that when our students come, they're not hungry, they're safe from different perspectives, not just the physical aspect, but also the psychological aspect. And there's a lot of variables that go into that. So for us to be able to focus on providing safety for our students, and really in our student support area, we've had a focus on empowering our students, because as you know, before the pandemic, our average daily attendance was at approximately 94%. During the throes of the pandemic, we went down to 89%, and we've somewhat recovered, the key there being somewhat, to 91%. And so there's obviously COVID has not gone away, it's still with us. So students and families obviously and clearly heard the message, if you're feeling ill, don't come to campus. Whereas in the past, maybe, a student had a cold or runny nose, would say, oh, it's runny nose, come on to campus. That model's flipped. And now, obviously, again, our communities did pay heed. So it's important for us to understand that aspect, and also making sure that we're having discussions and trainings, professional development with our teachers, counselors, and others, so that we can provide that focus, so that students have a reason to come to school.
Moises, some of your teachers I know from the other day when I was down have this magical connection with kids. Somehow they have this more holistic connection. How do you bottle that, or how do you spread that magic to other teachers day to day, do you think?
Well, and that's one thing we're working on, again, with providing some really focused professional development. That's how you get to it, because it's a shift for some of our teachers to have this focus on social emotional areas, in particular some of the content areas such as mathematics or science. I think sometimes it's difficult to make that connection to social emotional well-being, but what we're finding through a data-based approach and participating in the CARE network through the Gates Foundation, is we're finding that it's offering the opportunity for students to demonstrate clear academic gains in areas such as math and science through social emotional practices. And so there's some professional development that we're providing to a number of schools, but it's a growth process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's incremental, and those are the types of things that take resources. And one of the areas that's limited our ability to provide these trainings are lack of substitutes. We are having a tremendous challenge finding substitutes and staff in some particular areas. So again, when we say resources, yes, it's funding, but it's also the human resource, the aspect of making sure we have the ability to provide the relevant training to bring these practices up to speed.
Okay. Mary, you want to get in on this one?
Yeah, I think that, educators have thought for a long time about the more holistic approach and the need for that. But we as a state are really struggling still to build an infrastructure that fosters this way of supporting students. And I think that some of the impacts of the pandemic have brought that conversation to the societal level, and really thinking about this versus, districts operating in isolation and, maybe a few shining stars who have been doing this work for a long time. It has elevated that. I think it's created a greater sense of urgency around the issues that we've highlighted. I think that this also has given us an opportunity to build on prior investments to school climate. Thinking about investments in things like restorative practices, which are heavily dependent on relationships, are a way that we can kind of build upon those things. I think there are some really encouraging signs about the system shifting towards this. I want to be cautious about the fact that we're seeing somewhat of a shift to categorical programs, and that we hope that won't unintentionally reinforce the existing silos that we had. Because as we've been talking about today, for the learning to happen, students have to come to school fed, that they have to have that connection that we've been describing. And the instruction itself has to be more engaging. And a lot of people have been doing really intensive work on this for some time, but it elevates it to a more systemic level. And I think that gives me a little bit of hope if we can continue that. Yeah,
thanks, Mary. Ed, you used the word coherence and maybe the lack thereof, given the generation of new categoricals that Mary just mentioned. Thinking about school finance, medium term, long term, where do you think Sacramento should go in terms of helping districts with flexibility and coherence? How can the state better free up some of these creative ideas locally?
I think we were on track pre-COVID, right? So I think about a retreat that I participated in with our 15 district leaders of our 15 districts in El Dorado County, and we were looking at LCFF. Obviously, we were in the process of the development and implementations of our LCAPs, and there was a collective agreement across the county. Let's focus on instruction and learning. Let's really, sharpen our instructional strategies. As I referenced to you, there are multiple small districts in our county, so collaborative structures become really important. And that was our high priority and then COVID hit, right? And so there was just obviously all of our shifts in kind of basic needs, ideas, and safety, and yet it was difficult to collaborate in a way that we wanted to. So as the funding started to roll down, as Julien summarized so well in the report, in addition to some of these larger initiatives, the mental health initiatives, the community schools initiatives, as was acknowledged, there are multiple plans, and there's plans with timelines. And when you're dealing with smaller districts, we know that becomes difficult for leaders to maintain, progress in updating those plans, let alone the accounting that has to come with that as well. So it begins challenging, or it creates challenges in really maintaining coherence. I would say, as we're moving into 23, 24, 25, there is a sense of renewal in looking at the fundamental collaborative structures, looking at, appropriate interventions and strategies, instructional strategies, with a refreshed sense that we felt pre-COVID. So it's coming back, but we're really, taking a look at our data, and the funding assists us with increasing professional development, obviously increasing our day, as well as just intercessions. And I can go on, but again, that just gives you a sense of what we're trying to stay focused on.
Okay, great. I just want to remind our audience to please submit your questions, because we'll be turning to your questions in just a couple minutes. One other question for the panel is, how, as the stimulus dollars wind down, what challenges or opportunities does that provide in consolidating your local budgeting and sorting through key priorities? I mean, Julien mentioned how a lot of district hiring has been of classified staff, when you can find those folks to fund after school programs, TK expansion, classroom assistants. But as the stimulus dollars wind down, what are the hard trade-offs and priorities that you all are facing? Moises, you want to start?
Yeah, so there's a significant room here for both opportunity and challenge. For us, we demanded of ourselves the ability to be strategic from the beginning, knowing that this was going to be one-time funding. And so for us, this funding offered an opportunity as a bridge to help us get past the initial phases of the pandemic. But we're also keenly aware of the impacts it would have on the back end when the funding goes away. And we have as a fundamental belief in our district that we try to not make decisions that have long-term negative consequences on our employees. And so if that's the case, then we work with our associations, and we had a degree of trust, I think, that was significant in our district with our associations, because in the past we had been participants in the California Labor Management Initiative through the CDE Foundation, where we come together once a year and foster collaborative approaches to collective problems. So I think the ability to make have those discussions and make those decisions in a way that was collaborative really facilitated our responses. Now, moving to next phases, I think that's definitely going to be a challenge, because as much as we've tried to braid the different funds, and as challenging as that's been with the different plans, and some in the field have kind of called it a plandemic colloquially, where all these plans were demanded of us. We always try to keep a lens towards braiding the funding, being strategic, understanding that much of this funding was one-time in nature. So we've been mindful so that we can keep some of these practices, but ultimately we're beginning the drawdown phase of this funding. And the challenge is that we see so much opportunity of what we could have done or what could be done. And then to have this funding go away, I think is just, it's a challenge for us to see the possibility and the promise. And then now because, you know, the funding is phasing out, then to phase out some of these services, I think is a challenge. But on the ground as a district, and I think those of us kind of county office of ed or school districts, we're making plans, we're adjusting now for what is to come in the future. And that is a future with less resources. And how do we adjust? In addition to other challenges that were already pre-existing throughout the state of California, such as declining enrollment for different reasons. So just there's layers that we have to be very intentional about planning. And so to add plan on top of plan on top of plan sometimes gets a little bit overbearing. So if we were allowed the ability to have that local flexibility through kind of that honoring the intent of LCAP and LCFF, I think that would allow us to have a degree of local discretion that is starting to feel like it's eroding because of the different requirements that are coming down to a degree.
Great. Mary?
Yes, I think that one thing Moises mentioned, and I think is worth really highlighting, is that there's a really big narrative about the idea that schools have been, you know, just flush with cash, this idea that, you know, we have these unprecedented investments, and it's correct. These are unprecedented investments, but I think we can't see it in the vacuum. So number one, we were kind of backfilling under-resourced systems for a long time, but also we have this fiscal uncertainty. So at the same time, we're trying to make decisions about how to use one-time funding to support things like staffing around providing these services. With declining enrollment is such a big concern. And also lately, the volatility of economic conditions that are impacting how large Prop 98 is. So I think that understanding that context is important when we talk about the narrative of all of these investments. It really impacts local decision makers' ability to plan strategically. One thing that Ed mentioned that I want to kind of highlight is that as things have moved along, we've shifted from crisis mode. You know, we had to shift immediately to distance learning. And then we had, you know, different outbreaks, you know, that would maybe require some changes. Omicron was a particular challenge, substitute shortages. It's really hard to be strategic about your investments when conditions are changing so quickly. So now is an opportunity for us to be more strategic. And what Ed is highlighting is kind of looking at this final push through these funds. I think we're in a good position to be more strategic than we were right at the outset. I think when we talk about the impact of the different plans and the reporting, it's really important to think about, on the one hand, a lot of these relief funds are fairly, if not very, flexible, and that's great. The challenge is when you create so many new categorical programs on top of existing ones, each with different requirements for reporting, sometimes needing other plans. It's the cumulative impact that really makes a difference. And it's a particular burden for our small districts. So if you've got a superintendent who's also the principal and also running a bus route, you know, and you don't have a huge administrative staff to do all of the different reporting. And I think that component is also really important as we think about this, as well as if we want districts to be strategic and braid those funds, for a lot of districts, you know, some additional support is needed so that they can do that effectively.
Thanks, Mary. It does seem Sacramento has pushed at least a couple of huge policy themes. One is this more holistic view of children and student development. The other is to extend instructional time through extended day. But now that Sacramento's pushed those themes, I think the question, as you're saying, is, will the funding continue for those new priorities, or do we have to pull back just as we're starting to experiment in these new kinds of ways? again, for the audience, if you want to submit your questions, we have about 20 minutes left or so. And that's at PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. One question we're getting coming in from a viewer is, what are successful strategies or interventions to mitigate against the drops in proficiency, to mitigate against learning loss for underrepresented populations? As Julien showed in the report, the level of learning loss is greatest for kids of color and for older students at the high school level relative to elementary school students. But what seems to be working for you all, and what are you hearing from districts in terms of mitigating against learning loss? Ed, you want to start?
Sure, I'll kick it off. So again, the dollars assisted, and I'm thinking of our high school district in particular, in El Dorado County, the ability to invest in professional development in a manner that they had not in the past. So there was an agreement to build an additional professional development day in the year, and then really look at collaborative structures to improve instruction with, among teachers. But there was a focus on interventions within the day. So especially when we were looking at extended learning, it becomes more challenging, even at the high school level. So I know that our high school district had the opportunity to revise their bell schedule or build in an additional period of academic support. And while there were the structures to provide additional support, I think looking at instructional strategies to assist teachers with students who were behind became a really important piece, specifically in our math and science classes in particular. But that was a significant win for our high school district. Of course, I could expand on the different type of assessments that they started to utilize, but I'll stop there because I know Moises also is looking at things from the high school district.
Okay. Moises?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think just to kind of add on to what Ed was mentioning, for us, really making sure we're providing that deeper level of professional development to ensure effective first instruction. I think that's where you want to focus, and then bringing in support such as we have a high dosage tutoring that we brought on board to make sure we're, particularly in the area of mathematics as well. That's an area that we've seen that needs a lot of acceleration. So to be able to have those resources has been really helpful. Particularly as the other thing is, as a district that sits right on the California border with Baja California and Mexico, we have a very significant number of English language learners. So to be able to do those professional development areas to make sure our teachers have those most up-to-date strategies, pedagogy in terms of supporting our English learners, our students with disabilities, our foster and homeless youth, I think is critical. And so the ability to have had these resources to really bring in this top-notch professional development to make sure we have that focus. So a lot of these strategies were already in place pre-COVID, but COVID was just such a disruptor that to be able to refocus our district on these best practices from a pedagogy perspective has been critical. The other area that really helps support learning is empowerment, and our student support services has focused on supporting our student, providing those opportunities for our students to make sure that we have a wide array of areas to engage our students, whether it's visual performing arts, whether it's athletics, whatever it may be, to be able to make sure that we're engaging our students, because an engaged student is a student who's ready to learn.
I know from one of our other case study districts in LA County has added a 7th period, Moises, to try to provide more electives for students, because I think the feeling with accountability has been students have been pushed in reading and mathematics and not given options that they want to pursue and have intrinsic interest. So adding a period or trying to broaden the curriculum is something else we've been hearing. Another question, guys, from the audience is, how are districts trying to deal with absenteeism and re-engaging students and families? mean, Moises, you made a good point that families got the message. We want them to be careful and care for their own safety and day-to-day health, but that discourages school attendance. So what's working, do you all think, in terms of re-engaging students and families, and what's the potential for continuing to fund those efforts is the question we're getting from a viewer. Mary, you want to start?
Sure. I think that a few things that we've seen people do with their relief funding in particular was hire staff specifically who are re-engagement specialists, who are really able to build relationships with families and with students to identify, what is the root cause of particular students' lack of attendance, and what are the resources that the district or the county office can provide to address the issues so that we can get students back into the classroom. So I think that that's been one really good use of the funding. Districts prior to the pandemic, many of them were hiring family and community engagement people. That's another, place where they've tapped into this relationship building, particularly hiring people from within the community, and particularly hiring people who speak the home languages of many of the students. Because again, that sense of connection, that sense of the attention to students and the resources that they need for their specific challenge, I think has been something that these dollars have allowed districts to do. And I hope that that's something that, we'll be able to continue moving forward.
Yeah, those are vivid examples, Mary, and thanks for highlighting sort of the cultural situated character of this task of building back trust with families. It is very localized in that sense. Ed, what else are you hearing from your districts in terms of working to re-engage families and reduce absenteeism?
I think the examples noted, I would be able to echo. I think I'm going to approach this question a little more from a different angle. The staffing shortage issue is significant and destabilizes schools and systems. And so when we know we have consistency in the classroom that assists with engagement, assists with connection with students. And so what we are really looking at are other investments around a teacher residency program to really onboard professionals well. I've been in the county for 10 years. There's 15 school districts. We've seen well over 15 shifts in superintendents over the last few years. That's uncommon at the superintendency level, let alone speaking to the challenges at the administrative ranks. So from instructional aides, teachers, principals, right up to district level leadership is an important piece that I think stabilizes the system and allows a level of consistency in the manner in which we serve our students. So we've had difficulty when it comes to chronic absenteeism. We have 11 of 15 districts in differentiated assistance as a result of chronic absenteeism. Pre-COVID, we were resting at 94, 95%. Average daily attendance, and now we're hovering around 90, 91, depending on which district that you're looking at. So we are trying multiple strategies to incentivize and leverage students coming in. And I think, again, beyond what Mary and Moises say, I would just acknowledge that we're working with our partners, right? Our nonprofits, those who are assisting with our extended day programs as well, trying to incentivize students to be engaged and come to school.
Great, thanks, Ed. Another question is, you have been talking about various interesting innovations and new practices, but with the fiscal cliff coming, how will you try to preserve some of those innovations, and which innovations are most important to sustain going forward? Moises, you want to tackle that one?
That is a critical question moving forward. And I think sometimes we have a reticence about having a really frank discussion about this, where we try to be as creative as possible. We leverage grants, we work with foundations, we try to find solutions. But I think the reality is that if funding does kind of phase out, then we are going to have to make some difficult decisions that nobody wants to make. And that is just, I think, a really hard reality that we all contend with on the ground. In terms of which practices do we want to maintain, obviously it's those that engage our students, because again, an engaged student is a student who's ready to learn. We have a shorthand of saying you can't bloom until you Maslow. So basically you can't get to the higher order thinking skills if a student is coming to school hungry, if they're coming unsheltered. So there's a lot of things that go into teaching and learning. It's not as simple as sitting in a classroom, here's the instruction. There's a lot that goes with that. So how do we prioritize? We're going to have to go through that process over the coming years, because we see the phasing out of this federal funding. And we also see, based on declining enrollment, another decline in revenues. In addition, we haven't seen the average daily attendance kind of tick up. So there's multiple challenges on the horizon. As a responsible steward of a school district, I think it's incumbent upon us to really take a sober assessment at what we see coming on the horizon, and then make decisions in partnership with all those who depend on us from an ethic of care for all of our students and all of our employees, which is really challenging in an environment where you can anticipate a decline in enrollment and a decline in resources. So how do we manage that responsibly through things such as attrition? We have less students, we're probably going to be a smaller school district. Are there ways we can leverage our facilities strategically? Again, beginning from an ethic of care for our students and our staff.
Mary, thoughts on what innovation should be preserved and maybe how the state can help in that regard?
So from a state perspective, not to go back to this time and time again, but I think it is really relevant to this question. Greater investments in the base funding, the funds that districts are able to be able to preserve those programs that they're identifying. Because again, if we move to more categoricals with greater restrictions, it gives districts less flexibility in identifying funding sources for those pieces. I think that from a district perspective, I think we should be thinking about what conversations we're having now. And I know many have already started, but if you haven't, this would be the time to really sit down and do two big things. One is, really examining what data do you have, and what are you collecting? What do you need to start collecting around the impact of some of the programs that you started, and also the community engagement piece. Because, ultimately, as we are thinking about that ethic of care that was just discussed, what are the community members identifying as needs and priorities that really need to be moved forward? And so I think those are kind of key pieces for both the state and local level.
Great. Ed, Moises, to help us wrap up, what would you suggest to Sacramento, given all that we've talked about? Ed, you want to start?
Sure. I think that, so first of all, there definitely through COVID, there was just this sense of urgency. And, the strength of our communities, and I think throughout the state, there's just been a level of resilience. Like there's this sense of coming back. But I think that we do not want to lose that sense of urgency and nimbleness. I agree with Mary in terms of protecting the base, continue to look at streamlining plans, not overcomplicating things. We are locally trying to protect the fundamentals. We're speaking to professional development structures. We even now are really focusing on P3 efforts and above, focusing on mathematics, identifying what bright spots are taking place throughout the state that yet are similar in local context. So it could be looking at grade level standards, effective instructional practices, building teacher administrator capacity, right? And just monitoring how can we improve in our utilization of data. I know it just sounds like very fundamental pieces, but it's easy to clutter that level of focus and distract that. So that's why I'm just coming back to the fundamentals.
Great, thanks, Ed. Moises, we got 30 seconds.
I'll be brief.
Last
I'll agree. So for me, it's really about fomenting a sense of trust at the local level, that we trust our state policy and state and federal policymakers will support us in our need and will listen to us. And from the state level, that they trust us at the local level through conversation and dialogue and collaboration to identify those high areas of need and support, so we can have a collaborative effort, because it really does take a village.
Great. We're going to have to call it there, guys. Mary, Ed, Moises, thanks so much for spending the hour with us. And Julien Lafortune has disappeared from the screen, but thanks to Julien and his team for a stimulating report and encouraging this kind of conversation between state policymakers and local implementers. So thank you all for joining, spending the last hour with us. It's been a pleasure. And stay tuned for follow-up reports from the PPIC team. Take care.